afternoon. My name is Ashton Adams. I am a member of the Dole Student Advisory Board, and I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's program. On behalf of the Dole, I have 3 requests. Please turn off your cell phones. And then we will also have a Q&A session immediately after the program. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a staffer to bring you the microphone. And third, please do ask a single question. Our director doesn't tolerate filibustering on questions. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our director, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Ashton, and thank all of you for coming out. It's a warm, sunny Friday afternoon, and I know there are other places that everyone could be, but I'm delighted that you chose to come to the Dole Institute and be part of this very important program today. Today's program is part of our Presidential Lecture Series 2011, which is currently going on. The other parts of the program, I interview Richard Norton Smith, who's a presidential historian, the first permanent director of the Dole Institute, about 4 various presidents. We did President Reagan on the 30th. Wednesday night, we did FDR. This coming Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m., we will talk about Eisenhower. And this coming Thursday night at 7:30, we'll be talking about Woodrow Wilson. So it's been a very popular series. We've had a full house for the first 2. My guess is we'll have full houses for the last 2, so get here early and claim a very good seat. Also keep in mind, and all the programs, upcoming programs here at the Dole Institute are listed on the back of your program today. But on March 1st, we have a very special treat. The geographer of the United States, Mr. Lee Schwartz, who works for the State Department, will be here, and that should be a fascinating program. Today's program will be followed by a book signing out in Hanson Hall, so if you haven't picked up a copy of the book already, you're all required to do so. Actually, we would appreciate it if you would. I have my copy already. Actually, Susie has our copy already, and Robin will be happy to sign those for you. Now, I have to admit a little bit of a bias here. I think many of you who come to Dole Institute programs know that I worked for President Reagan on his last 2 campaigns and also in the White House. If you've studied Reagan, you probably know he is far more complicated than his critics during the 80s knew, and also more complicated than many conservatives today are willing to admit. He was bright, intellectual, and a great listener, and he was pragmatic and philosophically flexible. And of course, as Robin is about to talk to us about, he was an extraordinary communicator. We're delighted to host Professor Robin Rowland today. He's a professor in and director of Graduate Studies of Communication Studies here at KU. He's widely published, received many honors. I won't go back through all of his bio because you have that on your program. But his most recent book is Reagan at Westminster, Foreshadowing the End of the Cold War. Based on this book and roughly a dozen articles on the rhetoric of President Reagan, he was recently asked to present the keynote in a panel on Reagan's rhetoric jointly hosted by USC and the Reagan Presidential Library as part of the Reagan Centennial celebrations. That's an extraordinary honor for Robin, for the University of Kansas, and we're honored to have him here today. Professor Robin Rowland. Robin?
Thank you. It's just wonderful to be here. I want to tell you, the event that Bill was talking about, it was fabulous. It ended up with a dinner where we were they have a version, it was one of the planes in the rotation for Air Force One. And I remember thinking that this was kind of that moment where I thought, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. But this is better. I've spent most of my life at KU. And speaking at the Dole Institute that has done so much for KU, and an institute named after Bob Dole, I can say as a lifelong liberal Democrat, Bob Dole did so much for KU and so much for Kansas that this is an enormous treat for me. Thank you very much, Bill. On June 8th of 1982, Ronald Reagan spoke in the Royal Gallery at Westminster. He spoke about the need to reduce nuclear weapons, but his speech is most remembered for his defense of classical liberalism and democracy. He famously said that we live at a turning point in which there is growing consensus rejecting the arbitrary power of the state. He claimed that we are witnessing today a great revolutionary crisis in the Soviet Union and pointed to a host of nations that were moving toward democracy. But he restated again and again the core idea of the speech, that democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. Today, when especially neoconservatives remember it, they remember this moment as one that produced, in Peggy Noonan's words, thunderous applause. No contemporary account verifies that. In fact, the contemporary accounts of the speech and the reaction to it, tepid might be too strong. It is notable that in the immediate response in the British media, the strongest praise was not about what he said, but about how he said it. There was particular praise for his use of the teleprompter, and in the words of one British newspaper, President Reagan's smooth, word-perfect delivery, and how members of Parliament surrounded him to see how he managed his rhetorical feat. It certainly didn't say much for the initial response to the speech, that the strongest response referred to the technology that he had used to deliver it and not to what he had had to say. And yet, today, it is universally remembered as one of his most important speeches. The conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer said on the 25th anniversary of the presentation of the speech that at the lowest point of the Cold War, a point when none of us imagined that this rock of the Soviet Union and the communism would actually be destroyed, what was so stunning about it was its optimism. Always the brightest commentator among the press, and perhaps I think the best biographer of Reagan among several very distinguished biographers, Lou Cannon, who spoke here with his son. Lou Cannon said that the Westminster speech stands the test of time as the most far-sighted and encompassing of Reagan's anti-communist messages, a judgment supported by John Patrick Diggins in his highly praised biography of Reagan, who said it is one of the president's two most famous addresses. And so we have a kind of rhetorical mystery. How could a speech that created so few ripples at the time, in fact, in addition to the tepid response, there was hostile response that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. How could a speech that produced so few ripples now be remembered as one of his most important speeches? In a way, this is like a mystery in which you've seen the crime and you've seen the ultimate resolution. And like that kind of mystery, I'm going to tell you how it happened. And I'm going to tell it how it happened by beginning with the situation in which Reagan spoke. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the drafting process, and Bill is exactly right about President Reagan. The stereotype about him as a mere actor is laughably false. And then I'm going to tell you about the speech, the response, and I'm going to talk about the ripples that have continued to come from that moment in the Royal Hall. When President Reagan, when he was then former Governor Reagan running for president, the single biggest problem he had was the perception that he was dangerous with nuclear weapons. In one Gallup poll, it found that 15% more people thought that Reagan was a risk of creating a war than thought that of Jimmy Carter. And President Reagan, in some of his early rhetoric, made people very, very afraid. In a very early press conference, the new president accused the Soviets of being willing to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat in order to accomplish their objectives. And despite that was factually true, still it was viewed as quite dangerous. And so, in the immediate period, Reagan faced very, very severe problems as the White House began planning for the trip. If people were afraid in the United States, and I'll give you a little bit more data about that in a moment, the problem was still greater in Europe, where he was going to go, first to a G7 summit, then to Rome, then to Britain, and finally to Germany. Writing in Business Week, Saul Sanders noted that the authorities in Germany worried about vast outpourings of youth and radicals who accused the U.S. of seeking world domination. There were similar fears in Great Britain. Let me read to you, and there were also many doubts about President Reagan's cognitive ability. Let me read to you what the comments of a commentator who had praised Reagan's sense of mission and resilience. This is Roy Hatterley. This is the commentator who praised Reagan. He said Reagan was a man of naive ideas and simple opinions, which he holds with the certainty of a Midwestern preacher. He characterized his views as two-dimensional views of life and stated that small print and philosophical arguments have never been his style. That's an ally. Richard Pipes, a Harvard professor, major expert on the Soviets, on loan to the National Security Council, he summarized it brilliantly in very few words. The English elite regarded Reagan as a dangerous simpleton. Now, the situation wasn't much better at home. Reagan, after his first year in office, according to Gallup, he had the lowest job rating of any president at a comparable period since Gallup started doing measurement. As the spring went on into 1982, the situation worsened, and Reagan's approval rating fell to the low 40s. It got so bad that in April of 1982, 52% of the American people were opposed to Reagan running for a second term, and the New York Times quoted a senior advisor to President Reagan as saying, "There's no question the guy's in deep trouble." One of the reasons that he was in deep trouble was the perception, as Michael Barone noted in the Washington Post, that a great many Americans and Europeans believe that Reagan is significantly more likely than his predecessors to get us into a nuclear war. And by the way, this is just one more example of why the conventional wisdom on Reagan has almost always been wrong. Well, that was the conventional wisdom. I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a few minutes. We now know that Reagan was a nuclear abolitionist. He wanted to get rid of all nuclear weapons, and that he was the most conservative person always in the room in terms of using force. He was the least dangerous person in terms of getting us into an unnecessary war. We know that now, but we did not know that then. In response to this situation, and to give you an idea how difficult a situation Reagan faced, Reagan, according to some people, James Reston said that he had toned down the martial music. In other words, he toned down his Soviet rhetoric. This led conservatives to accuse Reagan, and this is perhaps the harshest thing a conservative can say about a fellow Republican. One conservative commentator accused him of almost Carterizing American foreign policy. Not cauterizing, Carterizing. Cauterizing would be painful, but for a Republican, Carterizing, much, much worse. It was in this situation that the drafting of the address began. The head of the White House, a speechwriting office, R.M. Boxian did the first draft, a draft that everyone agrees was bureaucratic in its nature. I suppose he might not agree. It was, by all accounts, not a very good draft, although a little bit of it made into the final speech. It was at this point that Anthony Tony Dolan did a draft of the speech. And need to know that there is a distinction in the White House speechwriting office and in the White House between very true believers, who did not call themselves Reaganites, but often called themselves Reaganauts. And Tony Dolan would be perhaps one of the leaders of this. These are very hardline true believers and pragmatists. In fact, there is an anecdote where one of the true believers, one of the Reaganauts, talks about how they had to confront their biggest enemies in that they had to fight in the White House, and he said those were the pragmatists, the so-and-so, and the Soviets, and then he said, "Oh, I got those in the wrong order," meaning that the pragmatists and the White House staff were his biggest opponents. It was in this context that Dolan did a draft. Dolan says he did this draft primarily by researching other things that Reagan had said, which from my research I think is correct. It was at that point that the key moment in the drafting process occurred. President Reagan was given a copy of Dolan's draft and marked it up. I have a photocopy of that draft with me today. You cannot look at this for more than 90 seconds and believe that President Reagan was a mere actor. This was the key moment. A number of it goes on farther in the book. I have tried with my co-author John Jones to trace where every paragraph came from, and mostly we have succeeded. But I can tell you some overarching things about the drafting. About 16% came from the first draft, the bureaucratic draft. About 9% came from the first Dolan draft, almost without edits. Almost 50%, 46% was Dolan's draft as edited by President Reagan. 15%, 14.3% actually, was in Reagan's hand. And once Reagan wrote it, it pretty much was what was said. This means that Reagan either edited, sometimes quite heavily, or wrote roughly 60% of the address. What does looking at those edits tell you? The first thing it does is tell you that Reagan was quite skillful in cutting out unnecessary material. He cut out a number of things in the Dolan draft that made the speech read better. Second, he was a good stylist. There are many, many edits where he cuts out 3 words and makes the sentence stronger, or he cuts out 1 paragraph, draws a line, and links 2 paragraphs together and makes them read better. But he was more than a stylist. That he was also, in his edits, he would both sharpen and sometimes or soften the ideological focus. Often softening the ideological focus by, rather than saying that our opponents were the Soviets, he did say in one case, the opponent was totalitarianism. An edit that made it less confrontational but more ideological at the same time. And he also added several passages. For example, Reagan adds in his own hand the reference to the Soviets ending up on the ash heap of history, a reversal of what Trotsky had said. And Reagan also then adds several edits making clear his commitment to peace. You cannot look at this material and come to anything else except that Reagan was a gifted writer and an even better editor, and at least on Soviet policy in particular, quite involved in the details of the arguments going on in the administration. The idea that he was a mere actor is ludicrous, in my view. I now turn to the trip to Europe and the speech itself. The trip began with the G7 summit, which went so-so at best. Reagan then went on to Rome, where he had substantive meetings with the Pope, substantive meetings about the best way to fight against the Soviets, especially in Poland. The substance was overwhelmed, however, when there were photographs showing President Reagan appear to nod off. And he then went to Great Britain, where there were massive demonstrations. 100,000 people demonstrated in Hyde Park. And columnists continued to portray him as dangerous, in some cases drawing on the fact that he'd once been a movie actor. One British commentator labeled Reagan and Thatcher as the Lone Ranger and the Iron Lady. Another columnist referred to him as Old Hopalong, and said he needed to do some fast fence mending. A former Labor cabinet member said that Reagan will go down in history as the man who has done more damage to American security than any other president in alienating opinion in Western Europe among its people. As you can see, Reagan faced a daunting situation when he strode to the stage. And by the way, when he went into the Royal Hall, only about 1/3 of the members of Parliament or the House of Lords were there. Only 30 of 237 Labor MPs even came, which I think gives you a sense of the anger level in Great Britain at that time. Now, all of this is only a preview to what he said. President Reagan gave a thoroughgoing defense of liberal democracy that undercut and critiqued the Soviet state and totalitarianism on 3 levels. He built a strong historical argument that the trend was toward liberal democracy. He built a dialectical ideological argument about the superiority of liberal democracy, and he undercut the very language system of communism. What he did was quite sophisticated. If you think about it for a second, communists had always justified their approach as carrying out history, that they were on the right side of history. They'd always said that they had a scientific ideology, and they created a language system to support that. Reagan undercut and reversed all three of these points. Now, I do not have time in this talk to go through all three of these things in any kind of detail, but what I want to do is focus on what he said about the historical dialectic, the historical development. After an introduction in which Reagan was charming, as he always was, he begins developing the idea that the movement of history is toward democracy. He develops the idea that in the introduction, that in this introductory part of the main body, that the two great threats to the West today are war and totalitarianism. He begins to do this geographically by talking about how he is going to go to Berlin, where the Berlin Wall is that dreadful gray gash across the city. And he then goes on to talk about how one cannot be naive in confronting the dangers of today. He says, we have not inherited an easy world. And he cites from Gladstone, who said, you cannot fight the future. Gladstone, Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1880s. And Reagan then said, optimism comes less easily today than it did then. It was at that point that Reagan said that optimism is in order because day by day democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower. It's at this point that Reagan then discusses those two great threats. He talks about the threat of Armageddon, of the end of the world through nuclear conflict. And then he talks about the second danger, the threat posed to human freedom by the enormous power of the modern state. Reagan makes it clear, he says, that he recognizes that not all in the West agree on the details. He says there is a legitimate disagreement over the extent to which the public sector should play a role in the nation's economy or life. It is at that point that Reagan makes a transition. He quotes Winston Churchill as saying that he does not believe in the inevitability of war. And Reagan adds that today our mission is to preserve freedom as well as peace. One would think that that description would not lead one to optimism. But it is that point that Reagan begins to justify the optimism he had stated already when he said democracy is not a fragile flower. He says it may not be easy to see, but I believe we live now at a turning point. He says, in an ironic sense, Karl Marx was right about there being a great revolutionary crisis. But he says that great revolutionary crisis is actually in the Soviet Union, which has attempted to move against the tides of history by denying human freedom and dignity to its citizens. He then cites failures all across the Soviet state. He pulls this together, and I particularly love this passage, by talking about how refugees always flee away from totalitarianism. And then in two pointed sentences that Reagan wrote himself, he says, today on the NATO line, the line between NATO forces and the Warsaw Pact, our military forces face east to prevent a possible invasion. On the other side of the line, the Soviet forces also face east to prevent their people from leaving. Truths like that were very rarely spoken. He then talks about how there is growing consensus across the world, one unifying thread, on the realization that collectivism stifles all the best human impulses. And he then, in paragraphs that he wrote, traces the history of this, going back to the Exodus from Egypt, traces it up to the modern day. It is, and by the way, in this period, in this passage, at one point he references the Falklands War, which is ongoing, the only point in the speech he got any significant applause from the audience. The applause is going to be from history, not from the audience. And he points to these positive developments all around the world. And then at the very pivot point, he returns to the dominant metaphor of the speech. He says now the entire line I quoted at the beginning, no, democracy is not a fragile flower, still it needs cultivating. In the passages that follows, he talks about that cultivation. He talks about calling the Soviet Union to begin the process of change. He then talks about creating the institutions to support democracy. And I think in a very important passage, he makes the point that the values he's talking about are not Western values, they are human values. He says, democracy already flourishes in countries with very different cultures. And he, in a rhetorical question, I think he demolishes the idea that these are Western inventions to democratic liberalism. Who would voluntarily choose not to have a right to vote? He asks the same question about who wants to be in a society where you have a knock on the door from the police? Who wants to be in a society where you cannot trust the press? He's making the point that these are human values. Reagan then describes in quite global terms, with very few specifics, some efforts at democracy promotion that were later criticized as having not much substance. I think that's quite right. They didn't have much substance. It was the ideas that had the substance rather than the details. He also makes clear his commitment to real arms control, to cutting weapons, not merely freezing weapons. Then, in the conclusion of the speech, Reagan calls on the West to reject the shyness about using our most powerful weapon, our ideas, using these vast resources provided by the democratic idea. Reagan then has what I think is a particularly lovely transition. He uses the brief story of British pluck during World War II as a transition device. He refers to an elderly lady whose home was destroyed by the Blitz. According to Reagan, the rescue workers found a bottle of brandy she'd stored behind the staircase in the bombed-out home and offered her, I'm quoting her now, a taste of it, only to have the lady come around and say, "Here now, there now, put it back, that's for emergencies." Reagan then says, "Well, the emergency is upon us. Let us be shy no more." A point that noted both the crisis that faced and the power of the ideas he was talking about. He cites British courage and Churchill's excellence during the Cold War and quoting his optimism at a difficult time and says, "Why should we fear for our future?" Quoting Churchill. "We have," he said, "safely come through the worst of it." And then Reagan says the only thing in the speech that turned out to be quite wrong. Reagan uses this quotation to make a prediction. "Well, the task I've set forth will long outlive our own generation, but together we have come through the worst." He was not wrong about coming through the worst. He was quite wrong that it would outlive our generation. Reagan received significant applause, only when he talked about the Falklands. I think that is a fair summary of what the British press said as well. Many thought the speech was well written, but frankly, not very substantive. Writing in The Guardian, Jonathan Steele said it was the most important and controversial speech of his European trip, but after this proud rhetoric, Mr. Reagan's specific proposals sounded a little thin. A point that was also emphasized by many, as I'll tell you in a moment, I'll quote the New York Times, in the American press. Writing in the New York Times, Stephen Ratner quoted a columnist for the Daily Mail who attacked Reagan's oversimplified view of the world. Former ambassador to Washington, Peter Jay, labeled this as extremely hard line and seemed almost to be declaring non-military war on the Soviet Union. If he does it's very frightening. As you can see, the response varied between tepid and angry. The response in the United States was quite similar. A lot of it labeled some of the response. One commentator said that Reagan's argument about the precarious condition of the Soviet Empire was simply wishful thinking. You may remember Sam Donaldson, the ABC correspondent, who called it vintage Reagan, just that same old stuff we'd heard again and again. Jim Anderson, writing for UPI, said it had very few specific examples. The New York Times made that same point, saying that Reagan characteristically failed to point the way from here to there or to give the Russians a plausible range of policy choices, and concluded in reference to the president's dominant metaphor, "Flower power can work, but where's his spade?" There were also many hostile comments. Flora Lewis, writing in the New York Times op-ed, said, "It was good for Mr. Reagan to extol the values of freedom. To urge another crusade, another offensive struck a wrong tone." Others found the speech ominous, since a close reading, and now I'm quoting, made it possible that Reagan meant the administration was preparing to take major risks to bring about a rollback of Soviet power. There was support only from the conservative media. The National Review praised the speech, but a number of conservative commentators expressed a fear, and it turned out to be quite a correct fear, that Reagan might have actually meant what he said about arms control. That fear was soon to be realized, as a matter of fact. The strongest reaction, of course, came from the Soviet Union. On this point, Richard Pipes, who I mentioned earlier, he said that the London speech infuriated the Russians more than anything that Reagan had said or done since taking office. Let me read to you a little bit of what Izvestia said. They labeled the speech a slander of the Soviet Union and argued that the present Washington administration does not wish to come to terms with reality, will not accept the principle of peaceful coexistence of countries with differing socio-political systems, and is obsessed with great power chauvinism. The commentary went on to say that the Parliament has never before heard so many licentious insults directed at entire peoples, and sarcastically referred to Reagan as the new Messiah. The new Messiah has a bit of irony in it, since 6 years later at the Moscow summit, Reagan would be received by rapturous crowds within Moscow itself. And so we have a speech that at the time was perceived as not very substantive, not very important, or really dangerous. And yet now we see the speech as prescient in predicting the end of the Soviet Union, and as sketching the importance of a liberal democratic future for our world. Let me talk about two ways this speech is important. Democracy development is the first of these ways. The National Endowment for Democracy came directly out of this speech. Carl Gershman, then the president of it, said, "As presidential speeches go, this one has had unusual staying power, and not just because it foresaw the collapse of communism, but also because it set in motion the institutionalization of democracy promotion as a core element of American foreign policy." And American foreign policy changed as well. Reagan, early in his presidency, had supported, frankly, totalitarian dictators who were on our side. But with the force of these words, that gradually began to change. Reagan, the administration provided support to dissidents in Eastern Europe. They were quite careful of that because of the risks, providing a translation, for example, of Animal Farm, some other modest steps. Outside the Warsaw Pact, they were more forceful in democracy promotion, and on occasion, as in the Philippines, the Reagan administration turned away from a dictator they had supported earlier and nudged Marcos out of power. It was a proud moment for American foreign policy. George Shultz deserves an enormous amount of credit for carrying out that. The second implication relates to Reagan and the end of the Cold War. In the initial end of the Cold War, a lot of people thought Reagan didn't have much to do with it. That theory's mostly gone away. There are two theories now out there. The neoconservative view is basically that Reagan made the Soviets quit. And I quote about this, but I'm going to summarize, I'm going to paint with a broader brush right now. There is an alternative view that Reagan turned toward peace in January of 1984 after getting a nudge from Nancy, and that he then pursued peace negotiations, and that's the Reagan that had the arms control agreements that, by the way, at the end of his term, almost all the significant opposition to Reagan's foreign policy came from the right, not the left. In one editorial, George Will confidently predicted that we would remember this as the moment we lost the Cold War. I think of that every moment I see George Will on television praising President Reagan. I wonder if he's going to take this back. Neither of these theories will do. The conservative theory, Reagan could not make the Soviets do anything. The Soviets decided to move toward reform on their own. And it is completely true that Reagan, from the beginning of his administration, advocated for arms control. And the liberal revisionist theory also will not do, because Reagan continued the attacks on the Soviet Union. You remember famously, the strongest of them was in 1983 in the Evil Empire speech. But as late as 1987 at the Brandenburg Gate, President Reagan famously said, there is something you can do to prove your reforms, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, open this gate. Even in 1988 at Moscow State, as I describe in here, Reagan calls on the Soviets to institutionalize the force for reform. Neither of these worldviews will do. There is an alternative theory. And that alternative theory takes what President Reagan said seriously. Maybe he really meant what he said. This theory has three parts. Reagan did three things. He consistently labeled the Soviet Union what it was, a totalitarian society. When people were unhappy about the Evil Empire speech, was it they didn't think it was an evil empire, or they thought it was impolitic? President Reagan said in his autobiography it was a time for people to speak the truth to get their attention. Second component of this theory is that Reagan used a defense buildup not in order to prepare for war, but in order to prepare for peace. Reagan believed that the only way to get real arms negotiations, something he said at Westminster, was to negotiate from a position of strength. That was the power of the defense buildup. The defense buildup was primarily important rhetorically as the manifest proof to the Soviets that they could not bully us and they could not outcompete us. When Reagan saw Gorbachev in Vienna, in his autobiography, he says he told Gorbachev very much that exact point. And it was at that point, after he'd gotten the Soviet Union's attention, that the arms control agreements and talks came to fruition, leading to the elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons. And the third, and the most important element in this, was Reagan's commitment to liberal democracy. Reagan really believed that democracy is not a fragile flower, but he still took efforts to cultivate it. On the 25th anniversary of the presentation of the address, a democracy advocate from Sierra Leone spoke at the National Endowment for Democracy after all the other experts had spoken. She said, the answers to all these questions reaffirm what President Reagan said on that fateful day. Democracy is not a fragile flower, still it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideas, we must take action to assist the campaign for democracy. Indeed, these actions have sometimes been too slow in coming, but they have been consistently moving forward despite the slow pace. What this means is that more cultivation, encouragement, and support are needed in order to assure that democracy keeps moving forward. In the last weeks, we've seen what a fertile soil there is all around the world for that cultivation. In Tunisia and Egypt, Bahrain, all across the Middle East, proving day by day the wisdom of President Reagan said that day at Westminster. I'd be delighted to answer any questions, and we have a roving mic. This doesn't seem like a shy group, but you're being shy so far. I know a number of not shy people in this group. Remember, President Reagan said we should be shy no longer.
Thanks, Robin. Good talk. I want to take us back a year and a half ago. There were a number of us sitting in your office talking about this book in manuscript form. And one of the things we talked about is something you mentioned very briefly today. It was almost a one-sentence pass at it. You said that Reagan upended the language system of the Soviets. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering kind of what you've done on that point in the last year and a half. If you could just expand a little bit on kind of the shape that's taken.
Well, I will say, I think of the three strategies that Reagan, the three big reversals, I think that's the least important, but Reagan was quite clever, and I think Richard Pipes undoubtedly had a role in this. Remember Trotsky, and I'd have to find the exact citation, talked about how he said capitalism in the West would end in the dustbin of history. And so Reagan is alluding to that. And Reagan also, the very language of the book, he has this dominant metaphor of democracy as not a fragile flower, and he means that it will take growth any place that we plant the seeds and provide some cultivation. He has this phrase he says about the Soviets. He says in the 30 plus years since the end of the Second World War, no regime has taken root, he says, because regimes planted with bayonets never take root. And he's making the point that the democratic idea is powerful. It is like something natural that will grow wherever there is light and sustenance. I think, he was clearly right. Being right's a powerful thing,
Thank you, sir, for your talk. One distinction that I was hoping you could elucidate on is towards the end of your talk, when you were speaking of the negotiation from a position of strength, the talk of defense build-up and the need to fight totalitarianism everywhere. Is there a distinction between that and suicidal brinksmanship, I suppose?
We now know. I'm trying to think which advisor it was. I think it's John Patrick Diggins' book, where he says the stereotype still exists that Reagan was John Wayne with a 6-shooter, and he was anything but that. And he quotes an advisor who said that Reagan was always the most conservative guy in the room in terms of putting Americans in harm's way. I think I've read now two different significant foreign policy advisors who say that they don't believe from private conversation that if the Soviets had launched a first strike, they believe the president would not have responded with nuclear weapons, because he was so committed to avoiding a war that would end civilization. And if you think of American foreign policy in that era, we confronted the Soviets on periphery, but we never did anything to confront the Soviets in Eastern Europe directly. That's why a lot of people at the time said the democracy promotion efforts in the Warsaw Pact were pretty small. But the reason why, and it's either Diggins or John Lewis Gaddis. John Lewis Gaddis is perhaps the most distinguished historian of the Cold War, Yale University historian, if I remember correctly, and a liberal. And he points out that how careful Reagan was in the use of force. I think we were in fact, another part of the conclusion I've taken out is the neoconservatives often cite this speech as justification for the second Bush administration's effort to promote democracy with, perhaps unkindly, I might say, bayonets. And like Lou and Carl Cannon, I see no evidence that Reagan would have gone to war in Iraq. It is just the un-Reagan. Reagan believes that democratic ideas have to find their place in the particular soil, and that you cannot force that, and they will root on their own. He also was very careful about putting American sailors and soldiers and airmen in harm's way. If you think about where we did use force, Grenada, we pulled out of Lebanon. We were awfully careful. I see no sign of Reagan as a dangerous brinksmanship. The thing that's funny is that among serious historians now, not historians, political scientists, rhetoricians, the praise for Reagan's foreign policy is all on the left, not on the right.
Dr. Rowland, your talk made me think a lot about the rhetorical achievements of our current president, and I'm wondering if, and I know this doesn't directly relate to Westminster, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the parallels that you see between the two, and what wisdom you think President Obama has taken from President Reagan.
I guess it's a kind of an appropriate question. I've spent most of the last 25 years making people mad with what I've said about President Reagan. Now, the reason I say that is that about 25 years ago, I realized that Reagan was a principled small government conservative, but a pragmatist. And I also realized that Reagan was smart. And boy, those two views make nearly everybody angry. My liberal friends hate both parts. My conservative friends hate the pragmatic part. And so in that vein, I want to say that I see a number of strong similarities between President Reagan and President Obama. I think President Obama is a liberal, is principled, but is a pragmatist within those principles. I think that's very much like Reagan. I think very much like President Reagan, he talks about the two most important American national narratives, the American dream and American exceptionalism. Now, he does it a little different way, but while Reagan focused on individualism and the American dream, and Obama focuses on the community, and Reagan focused on the kind of the religious narrative in the city on the hill, and Obama's more focused on the kind of Enlightenment variant, but it's a nuance. And boy, today's political climate looks it reminds me very much of post-1982. This very serious recession leading to a loss of a lot of seats in the House. And, I think I see a lot of similarities between the two. Now, the big question is, will the economy coming roaring back as it did for President Reagan? And that's a big question. In some ways, by the way, the media environment, I think, is also very similar, with constant attacks on Reagan from the left, and really the mainstream media as a whole. We're very, very hard on Reagan. Lou Cannon really sees more of Reagan than almost anybody else. And his friends on the right seeing any move toward pragmatism as selling out. And you see a similar kind of thing going on with Obama, although the media environment may be a little bit more hostile now than then. The questions have been mostly among people who know President Reagan from books and films. There are people who remember President Reagan here. And Sure, like I say, whenever I talk about Reagan, I always think I will, because I've told you my theory about Reagan, I always offend somebody. I've always taken some feeling from that if I'm making both sides right, maybe there must be a measure of truth there. I can't entice any person who lived through the Reagan administration to ask a question. This was my goal. Well,
my husband and I were living in London when Reagan came to speak. And we were very proud of his. He and Maggie saw eye to eye.
Oh, they did?
And I had no idea that he was not received more graciously by the Westminster speech.
No, it wasn't much reaction there. I didn't even mention the British press was also filled with talk of there was a small gaffe occurred. When Reagan arrived first, he went to Windsor for a state dinner, and Reagan, being always a gentleman, he was always a gentleman. When they get off the helicopter, he lets Nancy walk next to the Queen. Apparently, protocol-wise, the Queen is the head of state, so the president is supposed to. But this goes against all of Reagan's upbringing. So I'm sure I'm sure he'd been told to do that, but his natural graciousness took over, and the British press made much of this, that it was just one gaffe after another. It's funny. The funny thing is, and I think about that in the politics of the moment, the things that we focus on a 24-hour news cycle, boy, they seem pretty small now, don't they, 29 years later. But the power of those words, that ringing defense of the human desire for justice, autonomy, free speech, and free press, those words still ring true. I think Lincoln was lucky that there weren't bloggers at Gettysburg.
knowing what you believe and think about Reagan, go back and switch your vote for him, maybe?
I hope you're not saying I was a conservative since childhood.
No, I said you were a liberal since
Right.
childhood. Yes,
Oh,
I know that well.
No, as you do. Well, I was afraid that this is a former teacher of mine. I'm afraid I'm being graded even as we speak. I might have to repeat the 8th grade. I am a much better writer now, I want to tell you. I have to be. But no, I mean, I'm a liberal Democrat. I don't agree with President Reagan's domestic policies, especially, but I have only admiration for him, and I see a lot. At the Reagan event at the Reagan Library. They had a series of historians, and a couple of the historians were talking about the negative things about Reagan. And finally, Luke Cannon had just had enough. And Luke Cannon has sharply criticized Reagan. But Luke Cannon said, let us put all that aside and just say right out front, Ronald Reagan was a great president. And that's the way I feel. I mean, I will also say that ending the Cold War, freeing 500 million people without war, is not a small thing. Not a small thing. And by the way, let me say one other thing, about this. Don't you think the fact that I can tell you in my private life, you'd find an Obama sticker on my car outside, but in my professional life, I'm not a liberal Democrat or a Republican or anything. I'm a rhetorical critic, and that's why we need universities. We need people with the training to look at the material and see what's there. If we just have the partisans or left or right, we never learn anything. I remember vividly when I learned that President Reagan, the single moment I was doing an analysis of the 1980 Carter-Reagan debate, and I was a debate coach at the time, so I thought maybe I should analyze it as if it were a real debate. And I did. And I thought, well, I know Carter's much smarter. He's a nuclear engineer. How come Reagan did a better job of answering the questions? And I said, I know Carter's much more on top of the issues than Reagan. How come Reagan used twice as much evidence as Carter? And then I said, and I know Carter is much better at the give and take. How come Reagan was like infinitely better than Carter in the rebuttals? And I remember thinking, oh, geez, the guy's smart. There's no other option. He was good in rebuttals. I was a debate coach. I knew you couldn't script rebuttals, Well, that's the advantage of academic training and objectivity. That's what that gives you. A reasoned judgment, not just an ideological judgment. Well, I'm afraid I filibustered, Bill. I hope I'm not in trouble. Well, you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.